I'm a 34-year-old guy, and I guess you could say I've been living a double life. Not in the spy thriller kind of way, but in the I have way more money than anyone knows way. Let me back up a bit to explain how this all started, because it's been one hell of a journey to where I am now. I grew up in a lower middle class household. My parents were the kind of people who worked hard, stretched every dollar, and taught me to appreciate what we had, even if it wasn't much. College wasn't in the cards for me financially, so I started learning to code on my own in high school. It became my obsession. By the time I was 20, I had launched a small tech startup with a couple of friends. We worked out of my parents' garage and ate ramen every night. Things took off faster than we expected. Within 5 years, our company got acquired by a major corporation. My payout? 8 figures. It still feels unreal to say that. I was 25 and suddenly had more money than I could comprehend. But instead of buying a mansion and a flashy car, I kept things simple. I stuck with my old mid-range car, wore the same jeans and hoodies I always had, and moved into a modest apartment. The way I saw it, I didn't want to change who I was because of the money. Fast forward a few years, I met my wife, Emily, at a coffee shop. She's an art historian, smart, funny, and beautiful in a down-to-earth way that made me feel like I'd hit the jackpot. We bonded over a shared love of old books and late-night conversations about everything from philosophy to bad movies. When we started dating, I decided not to bring up my financial situation. It wasn't like I was lying about it, I just didn't want my money to be the thing people saw first. So I told her I was a freelance developer, which was technically true. I still took on small projects here and there to keep busy. Things got serious quickly, and within 2 years, we were married. Her family, though, that's where things got complicated. Emily comes from old money. Her parents live in a house that could be mistaken for a small palace. Her dad is a CEO, her mom spends her days hosting charity galas, and her siblings all have fancy degrees and high-paying jobs. From day one, they made it clear they didn't think I was on their level. The first time I met them, I drove up to their estate in my 10-year-old car, wearing what I thought was a nice sweater and jeans. I could feel their eyes scanning me, and not in a friendly way. Her dad asked about my job, and when I said I was a freelance developer, he nodded like I'd said I was unemployed. Her mom smiled politely but kept steering the conversation toward Emily's potential and how she deserved someone who could match it. Emily tried to smooth things over, but it was clear they thought I was a downgrade. The snide remarks started small, a comment about how a simple wedding was so charming and not what they were used to, or how I must be a great budgeter since I didn't splurge on gifts during family events. I let it slide at first because I didn't want to cause drama, and Emily didn't seem to want to push back either. Things came to a head last Christmas. Emily and I had agreed on a modest gift exchange because we were saving up for a house or so, they thought. Her family, on the other hand, turned their annual gift exchange into a spectacle. When it was my turn, I handed out thoughtful but inexpensive presents, a leather-bound journal for her mom, a classic board game for her dad, and handmade candles for her siblings. I thought they were nice, but the room went quiet. Later, one of her cousins posted a meme on Instagram about men who can't provide, tagging me. It wasn't subtle. The tipping point was a dinner a few months ago. Her dad took us out to a high-end restaurant and, in the middle of the meal, loudly offered to pay for my meal since money might be tight. The table chuckled awkwardly, and I just sat there, fuming. Emily looked embarrassed but didn't say much, which hurt even more. That's when I decided I'd had enough. I've kept my wealth hidden because I wanted people to see me for who I am, not for the number in my bank account. But her family? They'd been judging me for years, thinking I was some broke loser who got lucky with their daughter. If they wanted a show, I was about to give them one. I spent the next week planning a way to set the record straight, not to show off, but to stop the endless passive aggression once and for all. This wasn't just about me anymore. It was about standing up for myself and the life Emily and I had built together. What happened next changed everything. Stay tuned because the reveal, let's just say they weren't ready for it. Update 1. The week after that disastrous dinner with Emily's dad, I decided it was time for things to change. Emily and I sat down at home one evening to talk about what had been happening. I laid everything out, the snide comments, the Instagram meme, and how her dad's stunt at the restaurant was the final straw. Emily didn't argue. She said her family could be overbearing and rude, but asked if I really needed to go to extremes. I told her this wasn't about revenge, it was about respect. Her plan started to form. If her family was so obsessed with appearances, maybe it was time to give them one they couldn't ignore. I booked a private room at a high-end restaurant downtown, the type of place that makes her parents feel like royalty, and invited the whole family under the pretense of wanting to improve our relationship. They loved the idea, thinking I was finally trying to impress them. Little did they know, this dinner wasn't going to go the way they thought. On the night of the dinner, I went the extra mile. I rented a luxury car, something sleek and ridiculously expensive, and picked up Emily in it. She rolled her eyes when she saw it, saying it was unnecessary, but I told her it was part of the plan. When we pulled up to the restaurant, her family was already waiting outside. The second they saw the car, they froze. Her dad raised an eyebrow but didn't say anything. Her mom looked like she was trying to piece together what was happening. Inside, the private room was set up with all the bells and whistles, candlelit table, personalized menus, and an open bar. Her family seemed impressed but also confused. Her dad made a comment about how this was a bit ambitious for someone on a freelance budget. I just smiled and let it slide, knowing what was coming. The first half of the dinner went as expected. Her dad dominated the conversation, talking about his business successes and how he recently upgraded his yacht. Her mom chimed in occasionally, steering the conversation toward how Emily could have married someone more secure. Meanwhile, the cousins whispered to each other, glancing at me like I was some kind of alien. The food came out, and the jabs kept coming. Her dad joked about how I must have saved up all year to afford the meal. Her mom laughed, saying it was nice to see me making an effort for once. What they didn't know was that I had already taken care of the entire bill before we even sat down. I'd arranged with the restaurant staff to keep it discreet until the end of the night. I let their comments roll off me, focusing on what was about to happen. When dessert arrived, I decided it was time. I leaned back in my chair, looking relaxed, and casually mentioned that I had a funny story to share. Everyone stopped talking and turned to me. I started by saying how much I appreciated their patience with me over the years. Her dad smirked, clearly thinking I was about to grovel. Then, I dropped the bombshell. I told them I used to own a tech company, which I had sold to a major corporation in my mid-20s. The room went silent. Her dad broke the silence with a laugh, saying that was a good one. Her mom smiled politely, clearly not believing me. I pulled out my phone and opened an old article about the acquisition. It had my name in bold letters alongside the multi-million-dollar figure. I slid the phone across the table. Her dad's face went pale as he read it. Her mom blinked rapidly like she couldn't process what she was seeing. One of her cousins whispered, "No way," under his breath. Emily, who had always known I was wealthy but not to this extent, looked at me like she was seeing me for the first time. The questions started pouring in. How much was I really worth? Why didn't I say anything before? Was I hiding money? I calmly explained that I had kept my wealth private because I didn't want it to affect my relationship with Emily or how people treated me. I didn't want to be judged for my bank account, especially not by people who didn't even try to get to know me. Her sister was the first to apologize, saying she had underestimated me and respected how I had built my life. Her mom, however, accused me of misleading the family and playing games. Her dad sat in silence, avoiding eye contact. It wasn't long before he tried to change the subject, but no one was buying it. The power dynamic at the table had shifted completely. Emily surprised me by stepping in. She told her family she was proud of me for standing up for myself, and that she was tired of them treating me like I wasn't good enough. Her dad looked like he wanted to argue, but her mom held his arm, probably realizing they were out of their depth. By the end of the night, the atmosphere was tense. Some family members, like her sister, seemed genuinely apologetic, while others, like her dad, were clearly trying to figure out how to regain control. When the bill came, the waiter quietly told the table it had already been taken care of. Her dad opened his mouth to protest, but then thought better of it. As we walked out, the looks on their faces were priceless. For once, I wasn't the one trying to prove myself. And this was just the beginning. Update 2. The drive home after that dinner wasn't exactly peaceful. Emily sat in the passenger seat, arms crossed, staring out the window. She broke the silence once to ask why I had to go so far. I explained it wasn't about showing off, it was about putting an end to years of judgment and passive-aggressive digs. She didn't argue much, but I could tell she wasn't thrilled with how public it all was. Still, she admitted her family's behavior had been out of line for too long. The next day, it became clear just how much the dinner shook things up. Word spread through Emily's extended family faster than I expected. By lunchtime, her phone buzzed nonstop with messages. Some were curious relatives asking if the story about my tech company was true. Others were more aggressive, accusing her of hiding the truth and humiliating her parents. Emily sighed every time a new message came in. Later that afternoon, her mother called. Emily put the phone on speaker so I could hear. It wasn't an apology. Instead, her mom criticized me for making the family look bad by flaunting my wealth. She said I should have given them a heads up if I wanted to make a spectacle. Emily defended me, reminding her mom of all the times they'd disrespected me. But the call ended on a sour note. As if that wasn't enough, her cousins started stirring things up online. One of them posted a passive-aggressive meme about humble beginnings, tagging another cousin who commented something about gold-digging men. It wasn't subtle, and it wasn't funny. I didn't respond, but Emily saw it and immediately messaged them, telling them to cut it out. Instead of stopping, they doubled down, sharing more memes about hidden fortunes and fake modesty. Emily grew more frustrated by the day. She called her mom and sisters, asking them to stop the gossip. Her younger sister, Julia, the one who apologized at the dinner, was the only one who seemed genuinely supportive. Julia admitted she was impressed by my success and said she respected how I'd kept it private. She also let slip that some family members were now bitter because they felt I'd upended their idea of how things should be. Apparently, her parents weren't as financially secure as they made it seem, and my reveal had made them look vulnerable in front of their social circle. 2 days later, I got an email from one of Emily's cousins, the same one who had mocked me online. He didn't apologize for the posts or his past behavior. Instead, he asked if I could get him a job at my company. He said he was impressed by what I'd built and wanted to learn from someone with my experience. The kicker? My company doesn't even exist anymore. I sold it years ago. I ignored the email. By the end of the week, Emily and I went to a family brunch her parents had planned. Walking into the room felt like stepping into an ice storm. Her dad barely looked at me, her mom plastered on a fake smile, and the cousins avoided eye contact altogether. The meal was tense, with her parents making passive comments about financial responsibility and the cousins whispering amongst themselves. A few of them asked intrusive questions about how I invested my money or why I'd hidden my wealth. I kept my answers vague and polite. Halfway through, I overheard a hushed conversation between her dad and one of her uncles. They were talking about debt, big debt. It sounded like her dad's business wasn't doing well, and the expensive lifestyle they flaunted was more of a show than a reality. It explained why my reveal had hit them so hard. I didn't bring it up to Emily right away, but I filed it away for later. That night, Emily admitted she was overwhelmed. She said her family had always used their wealth as a way to control people, but now she was seeing how toxic it had become. She worried about how all the drama might affect our relationship, especially with her parents putting so much pressure on us. We talked for hours and decided to set some firm boundaries. No more letting her family walk all over me. We'd attend events on our terms, and if things got out of hand, we'd leave. Just as we were starting to feel some relief, a message came through from her dad. He was calling a family meeting and wanted both of us to attend. No explanation, no details, just a time and place. Emily was hesitant, but I told her we should go. Whatever her dad was planning, I wanted to hear it firsthand. Something told me this wasn't going to be just a casual chat. The invitation left us both uneasy, but one thing was clear: the fallout from that dinner wasn't over. Update 3. The family meeting was set for Saturday evening at Emily's parents' house. By the time we arrived, the tension in the air was so thick, it felt like you could cut it with a knife. Their massive living room, usually a place for showy gatherings, was unusually quiet. Her dad stood at the far end of the room, arms crossed, while her mom sat stiffly on the couch. Emily's sister, Julia, gave us a small nod as we walked in. A few other family members were scattered around, avoiding eye contact. The meeting started abruptly. Her dad didn't waste any time explaining why we were there. He outlined how their family business, a long-standing company her dad had inherited, was facing serious financial trouble. It had something to do with bad investments and declining revenue over the past few years. The numbers he threw out were staggering. He admitted they were in deep debt and needed a lifeline. Then came the pitch. Her dad turned to me and proposed a partnership. He said with my resources and expertise, I could help save the business. He threw in some buzzwords about family unity and how this was an opportunity for me to prove I was truly committed to their family. The room went silent as everyone waited for my response. I declined. Politely but firmly, I told him that mixing family and business rarely ends well. I explained that while I sympathized with their situation, I wasn't comfortable risking my hard-earned wealth on a venture I knew nothing about. Emily stayed quiet beside me, but I could tell she was bracing for what came next. Her dad's face turned red. He accused me of being selfish and ungrateful, claiming I was letting the family sink when I had the means to help. He said I didn't understand what it meant to support family because I didn't come from one like theirs. I stayed calm, repeating that my decision wasn't personal, it was about being cautious. That's when Emily stepped in. She reminded her dad that we had no obligation to bail them out and that this was a problem caused by their own decisions. Her dad shot her a look of disbelief, like he couldn't believe she was taking my side. Her mom finally spoke up, pleading with Emily to reconsider and saying that this was a chance to bring the family closer together. Then the bombshell dropped. Her dad admitted that the business wasn't just struggling, it was on the verge of collapse. He had taken out several loans to keep it afloat, and now they were drowning in debt. He'd been banking on my money to turn things around. The room erupted. Some family members blamed her dad for the mess, while others turned on each other, accusing people of bad management decisions or not contributing enough to the business over the years. I stayed quiet, letting the chaos unfold. When things calmed down a little, I explained to the room that my wealth was hard-earned. I told them that I'd spent years building something from scratch and wasn't about to throw money into a sinking ship without proper due diligence. That's when one of Emily's cousins lashed out. He accused me of pretending to be poor just to humiliate everyone. He called me manipulative and said I'd disrupted the family dynamic for no reason. Emily's mom broke down at that point, saying she'd been under so much stress trying to maintain their lifestyle and appearances. She admitted that she and her husband had been hiding the extent of their financial troubles from everyone for years. Her dad didn't take it well. He stood up and stormed out of the room, slamming the door behind him. Julia, as always, was the voice of reason. She apologized on behalf of their parents and said she was embarrassed by how everything had played out. She pulled Emily aside and told her she supported us no matter what. A few other family members murmured their agreement, but the division was clear. Some people sided with her dad, blaming me for upsetting the status quo, while others acknowledged that the family's issues ran much deeper than my involvement. As things started winding down, I made a surprising offer. I told them I'd be willing to hire an independent financial advisor to review the family business. The goal would be to figure out if there was any way to salvage it without me directly investing. I made it clear that the process would have to be completely transparent and that I wouldn't get involved unless they followed the advisor's recommendations. Her dad eventually came back into the room, his face still flushed with anger. He begrudgingly agreed to the idea but warned me that I'd regret getting involved. I didn't respond to that. Emily and I left soon after, leaving the family to stew in the aftermath. On the drive home, Emily thanked me for offering a solution but said she wasn't sure her dad would follow through. I told her I wasn't doing it for him. I was doing it to give the rest of the family a fighting chance. What came next would depend on how willing they were to face the truth. The ball was in their court now. Update 4. The independent financial advisor I hired arrived the following week. His reputation was solid, and I made it clear that his job was to provide a completely unbiased assessment of the family business. Emily and I stayed out of the way, letting him meet with her dad, review documents, and speak with employees. From what little I heard, the process wasn't going smoothly. Her dad was resistant from the start, arguing that the audit was unnecessary and a waste of time. The advisor pressed on. Over the next few days, he uncovered what I had suspected but didn't fully expect. The business was a mess. There were loans taken out against assets that were already leveraged, suppliers that hadn't been paid in months, and employee payroll issues that were barely patched over. The biggest shock came when the advisor hinted at potential tax fraud. It wasn't just sloppy bookkeeping. There were deliberate efforts to obscure income and inflate expenses. The findings were presented at a family meeting. The advisor laid everything out with cold precision, charts, numbers, and a detailed report. It was brutal. Her dad sat there, stone-faced, while her mom kept glancing around the room, clearly uncomfortable. The accusations started almost immediately. Her dad blamed her mom for overspending, while her mom fired back about his reckless business decisions. He then turned on his business partner, who wasn't even present, claiming he'd been misled. I stayed out of it, reminding everyone that the advisor's role was to provide facts, not opinions. But the room wasn't having it. A few family members began turning on me, accusing me of digging up dirt just to embarrass them. One cousin, who had been vocal against me since the dinner reveal, claimed this was all part of a power play to make the family look bad. Emily did her best to mediate, but it wasn't working. Her dad's frustration boiled over at a family gathering a few days later. He accused me loudly of ruining his reputation. He claimed that without my interference, the business would have rebounded on its own. The room fell silent as he ranted about how I had no right to judge a legacy I wasn't part of. Julia stepped in at that point, siding with us. She called out her dad for deflecting blame and pointed out that the issues had been brewing long before I entered the picture. Her support meant a lot, especially since most of the family was either avoiding the conflict or siding with her dad. The tension came to a head at yet another family meeting. This time, her dad wanted to discuss next steps for the business. The advisor was invited back to present a restructuring plan. It was a solid strategy that would give the company a chance to survive, but it came with a major condition: her dad would have to step down as CEO. The advisor argued that his leadership was part of the problem and that a fresh perspective was needed to regain trust from investors and employees. I reiterated my offer to help fund the restructuring, but only if her dad agreed to step aside. He refused outright. He called the suggestion an attack on his authority and stormed out of the room, leaving the rest of us to pick up the pieces. Emily, frustrated, stood up and announced that we were done with the drama unless her dad agreed to the plan. She told the room that our marriage and mental health came first, and we wouldn't keep putting ourselves in the middle of a mess we didn't create. The family began to splinter after that. Some relatives quietly reached out to Emily and me, expressing support and apologizing for how things had escalated. Others, like the vocal cousin, doubled down on their hostility. Her dad dug his heels in, refusing to budge or even acknowledge the advisor's recommendations. The business continued to spiral, with rumors circulating that creditors were preparing to take legal action. Julia, as always, was our rock. She helped Emily navigate the growing rift in the family and even started talking about pursuing her own ventures separate from the family's influence. Meanwhile, Emily's mom stopped attending gatherings altogether, clearly overwhelmed by the fallout. Just when it seemed like things couldn't get more chaotic, her dad dropped a bombshell. He announced that he'd made a final decision about the business and would be revealing it at a family event the following weekend. The cryptic nature of the announcement left everyone on edge. Was he going to sell the company? Declare bankruptcy? Refuse to step down and let it crumble? Emily and I debated whether to even attend. We both agreed that we didn't want to be dragged into another spectacle, but part of me felt compelled to see it through. After everything that had happened, I needed to know how this chapter would end. Whatever her dad's decision was, it was clear the family would never be the same. Update 5. The family gathered for what was billed as the final decision meeting at her parents' house. The tension was undeniable as everyone took their seats in the grand living room. Emily and I stayed close to the back, observing as her father stood at the center, holding a folder that looked like it contained the business's financial documents. The room was packed, with cousins, uncles, and aunts whispering among themselves, speculating about what was coming. When her father finally spoke, his voice was calm but cold. He announced that he was liquidating the family business. The debts, he explained, had become insurmountable. There was no realistic way to save the company without massive sacrifices that he wasn't willing to make. He said this was his decision, and it was final. Gasps and murmurs erupted throughout the room. A few relatives jumped up, begging him to reconsider, offering ideas that felt more like desperate flailing than actual solutions. Others, however, immediately turned their attention to me. The accusations came fast, claims that I had forced his hand by digging into their finances and refusing to help. One uncle even stood up, pointing at me, and said that if I had just invested a fraction of what I had, none of this would have happened. Emily quickly stepped in, reminding everyone that the problems with the business predated me and that her father had made his own choices. Her calm but firm tone silenced most of the room, at least for the moment. Her father, however, didn't seem interested in defending himself. He simply stood there, letting the chaos unfold, occasionally glancing in my direction with a mix of resentment and defeat. Emily and I stayed silent, letting the family air out their frustrations. When the financial advisor suggested a restructuring plan to salvage some of the business's assets, her father shut it down immediately. He said the family had lost too much already, and he wasn't willing to let outsiders meddle in what was left. His pride was still intact, even as everything else crumbled around him. The advisor tried to explain how the plan could minimize losses and allow them to rebuild in the future, but her father dismissed it outright, insisting that liquidation was the only option. As the meeting wrapped up, the reality began to sink in. Some family members left immediately, clearly furious at how everything had played out. Others lingered, huddling in corners to whisper about what they'd do next. The family's once unified front had completely fractured. Those who had blindly supported her father were now questioning his leadership, while others quietly distanced themselves from the whole ordeal. The fallout wasn't limited to the family. News of the business's closure spread quickly through their social circles. It wasn't long before whispers about debts, mismanagement, and the sudden involvement of a financial advisor made the rounds. Her parents' carefully curated reputation took a significant hit, and Emily's mom stopped attending social events altogether. Emily reached her breaking point soon after. She told me she was done with the constant drama and guilt tripping. For years, she had balanced her loyalty to her family with the realities of their behavior, but this was the last straw. We agreed to set clear boundaries. From now on, we'd only attend family events on our terms, and any discussions about money or the business were off limits. Julia, as usual, was the one family member who truly had our backs. She decided to distance herself from the chaos too, saying she was tired of being caught in the middle of fights she didn't start. Over the next few weeks, she spent more time with us, and her bond with Emily grew stronger. She even started talking about launching her own business, inspired by the independence I had shown in handling my career. Emily, ever the optimist, suggested family therapy for her parents, hoping it might help them work through their issues. Predictably, her dad scoffed at the idea, dismissing it as unnecessary. Her mom seemed more open to the suggestion but ultimately deferred to her husband's judgment, as she always did. Before we fully stepped back, I had one final conversation with her dad. It was short and to the point. I told him my intention had never been to humiliate or undermine him, but to protect the life Emily and I were building together. I said I respected the legacy he had built but that the choices he had made were his own, and he needed to own them. He didn't argue. Instead, he nodded stiffly and admitted, begrudgingly, that he had underestimated me. It wasn't exactly an apology, but it was the closest thing to acknowledgement I was going to get. Life after the fallout felt lighter. Without the constant weight of her family's expectations, Emily and I found ourselves focusing on our own goals. We traveled more, spent weekends exploring hobbies we'd neglected, and even began discussing long-term plans like starting a family. Julia became a regular fixture in our lives, her positivity and ambition a refreshing contrast to the drama we'd left behind. The family hasn't completely healed. Some members have cut ties altogether, while others maintain a strained, distant relationship. But for the first time, Emily and I feel free to live on our terms, without judgment or interference. It's not the resolution I envisioned when this all started, but it's one I can live with. And that, in the end, is what matters most. Hey everyone, I'm Tyler, a 28-year-old guy who's always tried to be careful with my finances. I've spent the last several years building up a decent amount of my savings, aiming to eventually buy my own home. It hasn't been easy, considering my job doesn't exactly make me rich, but every dollar I saved felt like a step closer to independence. That was, until recently, when everything I thought was secure started to unravel. I checked my account like I do every month, expecting to see my savings comfortably sitting there. Instead, I saw a massive chunk of it gone. Not just a few dollars here and there, we're talking nearly the entire amount I'd been working so hard to build. Panic hit me immediately. I went through every recent transaction, wondering if this was some bank error or fraud. I clicked through the account details again and again, my heart racing faster each time. That's when I saw a transfer from my account to an unfamiliar one, a transfer I hadn't authorized. At first, I thought it must be some sort of hack or scam. But as I looked closer, I realized that the account my savings had been transferred to wasn't just some random stranger. It was my parents' account. They'd had access to my bank information when I was younger, back when they insisted on having it just in case of emergencies. I hadn't thought much about it since then, assuming they'd never use it without telling me. I decided to go straight to them to get answers. I didn't want to jump to conclusions, but I couldn't think of any logical reason for them to have drained my account like that. When I asked, they didn't try to deny it. Instead, my mom, sounding almost casual, explained that they'd used the money to help pay for my sister's wedding. She said they assumed I'd understand, that it was for family and only for the sake of joy. I didn't even know what to say. They took my money, my hard-earned savings, without asking, and for what? A wedding I didn't even have a say in? This isn't the first time I've noticed my sister getting preferential treatment. She's always been what you'd call the golden child, the one who could do no wrong, while I've had to be the responsible one, constantly looking out for myself. Growing up, there were always signs, but I brushed them off. Now, though, it felt different. It felt like they had no problem sacrificing my future for her big day. I pressed them further, hoping they'd at least feel a hint of remorse, or maybe apologize. But my dad, instead of apologizing, just looked at me like I was the one in the wrong. He said, "Tyler, you don't need a house yet. You're still young. You should be proud to help your sister have her dream wedding." Apparently, in their eyes, I should be okay with putting my life on hold because my sister's happiness is somehow my responsibility. To make things worse, my sister wasn't exactly sympathetic. When I tried to bring it up with her, she brushed me off, rolling her eyes and saying I needed to let it go because family comes first. She said I should just get over it, that it's only money, and I could earn it back. Easy for her to say, considering she's never had to worry about finances in the same way. Our parents have always been there to bail her out while I've been on my own. After that, I decided to confide in a few close friends about the whole thing. I figured maybe I was overreacting, that this was just one of those things families do. But my friends were horrified. They couldn't believe my parents would just take my savings like that, no questions asked, and they certainly didn't think I was overreacting. They encouraged me to consider cutting ties with my parents over this, and to talk to a lawyer. At first, the idea sounded extreme, but the more I thought about it, the more I realized that something had to change. The kicker? My parents haven't even apologized. They feel completely entitled to what they did. In their minds, it's like they're doing me a favor by even letting me know where my money went. They genuinely believe they had every right to use my savings because, to them, it was all for family. I tried to keep calm, but inside, it just felt like betrayal. This wasn't just about money. It was about trust, something I thought I had with my parents. At this point, I'm seriously considering taking legal action. I decided to consult with a lawyer just to see what my options were. The lawyer gave me a basic rundown, explaining what steps I could take to possibly recover the money. Just talking to a professional about it made me realize that this wasn't some minor family issue. This was theft, plain and simple, and I had every right to be upset. Losing my savings has been a huge setback. It wasn't just a number on a screen, it was years of careful planning, budgeting, and sacrificing. All of it gone, just like that, and now I have to start over. It feels like I'm back to square one, and honestly, I don't even know if I'll ever be able to trust them again. And to top it all off, the wedding invitations just arrived. They sent me one, as if nothing happened. I guess they expect me to show up, play the doting brother, and pretend like everything's fine. Part of me is tempted to go, just to confront them in front of everyone. But another part of me knows that showing up would only make me feel worse, like I'm condoning what they did. For now, I'm trying to process everything, but it's hard. I started going to therapy recently to help me sort through the mess. The therapist is helping me realize how much of this goes beyond just money. This is about years of favoritism, years of feeling like I'm just second best. I don't know where things go from here, but I do know that I need to start setting some boundaries. And one of those boundaries might just be skipping that wedding entirely. Update 1. After the initial shock of discovering my savings had disappeared, I couldn't just sit back and accept it. I needed to know exactly what had happened to my money. So I spent hours looking through every transaction, every cent. That's when I realized it wasn't just a simple withdrawal here and there. My parents had spent every dollar, not a single cent left. And from what I could piece together, it was all gone, poured into this wedding, all the luxury, the venue, catering, and who knows what else. They hadn't just borrowed the money, they'd emptied everything with zero intention of paying it back. As I dug deeper, things went from bad to worse. Turns out they didn't just use my savings, they'd taken a small loan out in my name too. Somehow, they must have had access to some of my information. Maybe they had documents I'd forgotten about, stuff they'd kept from when I was younger. The loan wasn't huge, but the fact they'd even gone that far, it felt like a whole new level of betrayal. After learning about the loan, I went to confront them again. I didn't even have words, just questions. Why take out a loan in my name? Why go to these lengths? But all I got in response was a dismissive wave, and my mom called me immature for even bringing it up, like I was just being selfish and dramatic over some family expenses. My dad went on about how they'd helped me enough growing up, and now it was my turn to help the family, and that meant helping my sister have her perfect day. Afterward, my sister messaged me, calling me out for ruining her big moment. According to her, I was being petty, making it all about the money, and apparently my attitude was tainting her happiness. She threw in the whole family comes first line, claiming I was overreacting. It was mind-blowing how she couldn't even see what was wrong here. It was like I was supposed to be okay with them draining my future for her celebration. Then came the calls from extended family. Some of them had heard my side, but more of them were only hearing what my parents and sister were saying. They were calling me ungrateful, claiming I was just materialistic and selfish, saying I'd lost perspective over a family matter. My aunt even told me I should be grateful my parents cared enough to include me in something as important as a wedding, as if losing everything I'd saved for my own future was a small price to pay. After all that, I decided to get in touch with my lawyer again. This time, I wasn't just gathering information, I was seriously considering taking legal action. My lawyer laid out the options, and after explaining the loan they'd taken in my name, he mentioned that I might even have grounds to claim identity theft if they'd used my information without permission. The thought of having to sue my own parents felt extreme, but at this point, I couldn't see any other way to protect myself. Around this time, I started wondering if I should go public with what had happened. A few friends told me I should share the story online, make people aware of what they'd done. It was tempting, but part of me worried it might backfire, especially since my parents were so quick to paint me as the ungrateful one. I knew that going public could blow up even more, and I wasn't sure if I was ready for that level of drama. Of course, my sister had no problem with going public. She'd already posted some cryptic message on her social media about toxic people who don't understand family loyalty. It was clear enough who she meant, and it didn't take long for people to connect the dots. Her friends started chiming in with supportive comments, probably unaware of the full story, just thinking she was dealing with some difficult family member. Back in therapy, I realized this whole thing wasn't just about the money. My therapist helped me see how I'd been dealing with this dynamic for years, always putting up with things for my sister's sake, always letting my parents prioritize her. I'd spent so much time just accepting it, thinking that was normal. But now, it was different. This wasn't just one favor or one instance of favoritism. They'd gone so far as to wipe out my savings, put me in debt, all for her, without a second thought. After some serious thinking, I decided enough was enough. I was done with the guilt trips and the constant pressure to sacrifice for my sister's happiness. I told my lawyer I wanted to move forward with the lawsuit. If they were going to treat me this way, they'd need to face the consequences. And if it meant getting the truth out there, so be it. Not long after, I started digging into my parents' finances, trying to understand why they'd gone so far as to take my money and the loan in my name. It turns out they were in serious debt. My savings hadn't just gone toward the wedding, they'd used it to patch up other financial holes, covering expenses that had nothing to do with family joy or celebrations. They were trying to live way beyond their means, and my money had been the band-aid they'd slapped over the cracks. Hearing this made things clearer but didn't make it any easier. I realized that I'd been a backup plan for them all along, just there to bail them out when things got rough. It was one thing to help family, but another to be used without consent. The lawyer agreed that with the loan and the unauthorized transactions, this case had solid grounds. He told me I could go after both the savings and the loan amount under fraud claims, considering they'd taken it without any clear consent from me. I left his office feeling more determined than ever, ready to take this all the way. In the end, I made up my mind not to attend my sister's wedding. I couldn't stand there and pretend everything was fine when my entire future had been wiped out for her big day. I knew it was going to spark more drama, but at this point, I didn't care. For the first time, I was choosing myself over the so-called family loyalty they'd been preaching for years. Update 2. After days of thinking it over, I made up my mind. There was no way I could sit through my sister's wedding, pretending everything was fine. So I officially declined the invite. I sent a polite but firm message to my parents, explaining that I wouldn't be attending. I expected them to be disappointed, but the reaction I got was so much worse than that. Within hours of sending the RSVP, my phone blew up with calls and messages from both of them. They didn't bother with subtlety. They called me ungrateful, saying I was being selfish and immature. Every message was more aggressive than the last. Apparently, not attending my sister's wedding was the ultimate betrayal in their eyes. My mom claimed I was tearing the family apart just because I wouldn't let go of a little money issue. It didn't stop there. My parents took it to social media, where they posted vague but obvious hints about me betraying the family and forgetting where I came from. They never mentioned my name, but anyone who knew us could put two and two together. It was clear they wanted everyone to think I was the one causing all the problems. Then, my sister sent her own message. In her eyes, I was apparently destroying the family over a few dollars. She even threw in some line about how I'd always been difficult, and that I was ruining her happiness over something that didn't matter. It's like she completely ignored everything that had happened. In her world, my money, my future was just some trivial inconvenience, and I was being ridiculous for even caring. This time, I decided I couldn't just stay silent. I sent back a long, detailed message explaining exactly why I was taking a stand. I laid out every single thing they'd done, how they'd used my savings without permission, taken a loan in my name, and dismissed my anger as selfishness. I made it clear that I wasn't going to be guilt-tripped into backing down. After sending that message, I knew what I had to do next. I blocked them. Both my parents and my sister were blocked on every platform and phone line. I'd tried reasoning, explaining, and standing my ground, and every time they just twisted it back on me. Blocking them felt like the only way to finally set a boundary and keep it. My friends were incredibly supportive. They'd seen the toll this whole situation had taken on me, and they were there for me every step of the way. A few of them even offered to help me gather any evidence I might need for the legal case. They reminded me that I wasn't alone, and that I was doing the right thing by standing up for myself. It helped, knowing they had my back. Of course, my extended family soon got wind of the situation. My parents must have told them their side of the story because I started getting calls and messages from cousins, aunts, and uncles. Some were outright accusing me of being ungrateful, saying I was acting like I was better than my family. A few were more neutral, just wanting to hear my side. I told the ones who genuinely cared that I wasn't cutting ties with them, but that I'd be taking legal steps to recover what was rightfully mine. Most of them were understanding once they heard the full story, but there were still plenty who chose to believe my parents' version. Now that I'd made my decision, I started on the legal side of things. I went back to my lawyer and began the process of filing the paperwork. There were more steps than I'd realized. I had to document every unauthorized transaction, provide evidence that the loan in my name wasn't approved by me, and essentially build a case that showed my parents had acted without my consent. It was draining, but it felt necessary, like a final step toward reclaiming control over my life. My parents didn't ease up on their social media campaign. They made several more vague posts implying that they were victims, that their family was being torn apart by greed. They didn't mention specifics, of course, but it was clear they wanted sympathy. A few people left supportive comments on their posts, probably believing the one-sided story. But honestly, I didn't even care about their posts anymore. I'd blocked them, and seeing the screenshots from friends just felt like a reminder that I'd done the right thing by stepping away. In therapy, I talked about all of this, trying to make sense of everything that had happened. My therapist pointed out that setting boundaries wasn't just about blocking them, it was about knowing that I had a right to protect my own future. I started to feel validated for choosing this path, knowing that just because they were my family didn't mean they could take advantage of me. I realized I'd lost years of my life to their constant demands and that focusing on myself and my future wasn't selfish, it was necessary. With that clarity, I started focusing on rebuilding. I reworked my savings plan, adjusting for the financial hit I'd taken, and began setting up a new account that only I had access to. Then, my parents tried one last move. They sent a message, relayed through a family member, saying that if I went through with the lawsuit, they'd disown me. It was supposed to be a final warning, a way to scare me into dropping everything. But instead, it only reinforced my decision to move forward. If their love was conditional on me sacrificing my future, then maybe I didn't need it. I decided to send one final message to the extended family, explaining that I was cutting ties with my parents and sister, and that I was pursuing legal action. I kept it brief and factual, making it clear that I wasn't seeking sympathy but simply stating my decision. I let them know I appreciated those who had supported me, but that I needed to do this for my own well-being. For the first time in a long time, I felt a sense of relief. I'd set my boundaries, made my intentions clear, and had a solid support system of friends who genuinely cared. The lawsuit was underway, and I was finally beginning to see a future where I could live on my own terms, without interference. Update 3. With all my evidence gathered and documents in place, I officially filed the lawsuit against my parents. I knew this was going to be a long, exhausting process, but there was no turning back. I was determined to recover the savings they'd stolen, and to finally stand up for myself after years of being pushed aside. Once my parents received the court notification, all hell broke loose. My phone started buzzing with messages from family members, mostly from my parents' side. Apparently my parents were furious, claiming I was airing private family matters and humiliating them in public. A few family members outright accused me of going too far, insisting I was taking it too personally. But I also knew that some of these same people had looked the other way when I'd been mistreated. It seemed like now that it was public, everyone wanted to weigh in. While that was happening, my sister added more fuel to the fire. She went on social media with a long post about betrayal within the family, making it sound like I'd suddenly turned on everyone for no reason. Her post blew up quickly, with friends and acquaintances leaving supportive comments, telling her to stay strong and praising her for putting family first. The whole thing was surreal to see, knowing I was the one who'd been sacrificed for her wedding. And yet here she was, claiming to be the victim. Screenshots of her posts started circulating, and a few people even messaged me to check if it was true. Friends who knew the real story reached out, offering support and assuring me they were on my side. A few strangers who had heard the story secondhand even sent me messages of support, telling me to stand my ground. One of the most difficult parts was facing the court process itself. Submitting all the paperwork, every transaction, the loan details, it was like reliving every betrayal piece by piece. But, in a strange way, it was also freeing. Documenting everything reminded me why I was doing this, that this wasn't just about money but about finally having control over my own life. My therapist encouraged me throughout, pointing out that setting boundaries like this was a huge step toward a healthier future. My parents weren't going to make it easy. A few days after they received the notification, they attempted to settle the matter outside of court. They had a lawyer reach out with an offer to pay back some of the money, but only a fraction of what they'd taken, and they were trying to avoid any official judgment. It was obvious they were worried about the public fallout and the embarrassment of a court case. But I didn't want a quick settlement that barely covered what they'd stolen. I wasn't going to let them off the hook that easily. I rejected the offer and decided to move forward with the lawsuit. The financial toll of the legal battle started hitting hard. Between the lawyer fees and regular living expenses, I was juggling a lot, and it was stressful. My savings were already gone, and the legal fees were an added burden. But even with the financial strain, I knew I was doing the right thing. Standing up for myself now meant a better future, free from the control and expectations they'd tried to impose on me. In the midst of everything, my sister decided to reach out one last time. She sent me a long message filled with emotional appeals, asking me to stop this madness for the sake of the family. She said our parents were suffering, that this was putting a strain on their marriage, and that I was destroying everything over a little bit of money. Her message was designed to guilt me into dropping the case, but I'd seen enough to recognize it as pure manipulation. She wasn't trying to make amends, she was just hoping I'd give in to the pressure. I blocked her, permanently this time, knowing that I didn't need her in my life if she couldn't see the harm they'd done. Once I'd cut off contact with them all, a sense of quiet settled in. It felt strange not to have the constant messages and drama, but there was also relief. For the first time, I didn't have to worry about their judgment or guilt trips. My focus shifted entirely to preparing for the case and rebuilding my life without them. The case itself started moving forward, though it was slow. Court dates were set, and the process was underway. It was a waiting game now, but I was prepared. My friends continued to support me, checking in regularly, helping me stay grounded. They reminded me that I wasn't fighting alone and that I'd already come this far. I knew the path ahead would be tough, but for the first time I felt like I was in control. This was my choice, my life, and they couldn't take that from me anymore. Update 4. Once the lawsuit was set in motion, there was a strange sense of calm that settled over my life. I was free from the constant messages, guilt trips, and family drama. Without all of that weighing on me, I started focusing on things I'd neglected for so long. I leaned into hobbies I'd put on hold, like running and learning guitar, and even picked up some new ones. Self-care became my main priority, and it was amazing how much lighter everything felt without family stress pulling me down. Therapy continued to be a big part of my routine. My therapist helped me understand how years of being dismissed and overlooked had impacted my confidence. I was finally seeing the patterns of favoritism and manipulation clearly, and she pointed out that my family's toxic dynamics had long prevented me from recognizing my own worth. This whole journey had felt like one drawn-out battle, but therapy made me realize I didn't have to keep fighting the same battles forever. I also got serious about rebuilding my finances. With my savings gone, I started a new savings plan, this time making sure there were safeguards in place, new bank accounts, updated security, and zero access for anyone but myself. I wasn't taking any chances, and it felt empowering to finally be in full control of my own future. My friends were a huge help here, too, giving me advice and even checking in with me regularly to make sure I was sticking to my goals. Through all this, my friends became my chosen family. They were there every step of the way, helping me navigate things I didn't even know I needed help with. Some friends even suggested going on small outings to keep my mind off the court case. A few of us went hiking, which I hadn't done in years, and others joined me for local events I'd never thought to explore. Each outing felt like a small celebration of my new independence, like I was reclaiming little pieces of my life. Then, out of nowhere, I got news of a job promotion. I hadn't even been expecting it, but apparently my hard work and focus had caught my boss's attention. The promotion came with a decent raise, which made it easier to rebuild my savings and regain some of the financial stability I'd lost. It felt like a reward, not just for the work I'd put into my job, but for the personal work I'd been doing on myself. The extra income allowed me to accelerate my plans, and for the first time I felt my goal of buying a home was within reach again. As the court case neared its conclusion, I noticed a real shift in my mindset. The lawsuit had once felt like a mountain I'd have to climb, but now it was just another step in the process. I'd done everything I could, submitted all the evidence, and my lawyer was optimistic. It was a waiting game now, but there was a calmness in knowing I'd stood up for myself. The peace was unexpected, almost like I'd found closure even before the final verdict. Reflecting on the whole concept of family loyalty, I realized how much I'd let those words trap me in the past. For years, I'd accepted being the less important one, sacrificing my own needs because family comes first. But now I could see that loyalty should never come at the cost of self-respect. I didn't owe them my life savings or my future just because we shared the same blood. It was freeing to finally shed that burden, to let go of an obligation I'd never asked for. Financially, I was in a much better place. With the promotion, my savings were slowly climbing back up, and I even started looking at houses again. There were setbacks here and there, but I felt grounded, like nothing could shake me from my goal. The dream of owning my own place was alive again, and every dollar saved felt like one step closer to true independence. On top of everything else, I found myself connecting with others who'd gone through similar family issues. A friend introduced me to a support group for people who were estranged from family members, and hearing others' stories helped me feel less alone. It was eye-opening to learn that so many others had faced similar betrayals. Each story was different, but the underlying themes of betrayal and the struggle for independence were all too familiar. Being able to share my own story without judgment was healing in a way I hadn't expected. My therapist even remarked on how far I'd come. She pointed out that I'd managed to go from feeling trapped to reclaiming my independence. I hadn't seen it as clearly as she did, but her praise made me realize just how much growth had come out of this nightmare. I had stood my ground, protected my future, and rebuilt myself in the process. Then, just as things seemed to be wrapping up, my sister reached out with a final plea. She messaged me through a mutual friend, claiming that the lawsuit was hurting our parents' marriage and that they were struggling because of all the stress. She begged me to drop the case, to think about the family and stop tearing them apart. It was the same tactic as before, appealing to my sense of guilt to make me back down. But this time, I wasn't buying it. I ignored the message, seeing it for what it was: one last attempt to guilt-trip me into sacrificing my future for theirs. I'd moved beyond that. They'd had plenty of chances to make things right, and they'd chosen to deny, dismiss, and guilt-trip me instead. There was no turning back. With the court date set, I was ready to face whatever came next, knowing I'd done everything I could. And with each passing day, I felt more at peace, more certain that I'd made the right decision. For the first time, I truly felt free, standing on my own, free from the expectations and burdens I'd carried for so long. Update 5. The day of the court case arrived quicker than I'd expected. As I walked into the courtroom with my lawyer by my side, I felt a wave of tension in the air. My parents were already seated across the room, avoiding eye contact entirely. My sister sat with them, her face a mix of annoyance and frustration, almost like she was angry with me for even showing up. When the trial began, my parents' lawyers started their defense by downplaying the entire issue. They argued that my parents had only taken what they needed and claimed that they had always assumed I would support family needs, especially my sister's wedding. They painted a picture of me as selfish and ungrateful, a son who was overreacting to something that should have been a simple family matter. The idea that I was in the wrong for wanting back what was mine was infuriating to hear, but I kept my composure, knowing my side of the story would soon be told. Throughout their defense, the judge maintained a serious expression, but there were moments, especially when they mentioned that they knew I'd understand eventually, where I caught a flicker of disapproval on the judge's face. It was clear that the judge wasn't impressed with their lack of remorse, and that gave me a bit of reassurance. Then, to my shock, my sister took the stand. I wasn't expecting her to be called, and I certainly wasn't expecting what came next. She doubled down on everything, insisting that I'd always been distant and difficult, that I'd never been there for the family the way she had. According to her, I was making a big deal out of nothing, turning on our parents for my own benefit. It was painful to hear, but I'd seen enough of her behavior to know this wasn't surprising. It was exactly what she'd always done, putting herself first, just like our parents had taught her. When it was finally my turn, I took a deep breath and stepped up. I shared everything, recounting how my parents had used my savings without asking, taken a loan in my name, and expected me to be okay with losing years of my hard work for something I had no say in. I laid out the years of favoritism, how they'd always put my sister's needs first, and how they'd dismissed me whenever I tried to set boundaries or even express my frustration. As I spoke, my parents couldn't hold back. They interrupted with defensive comments, trying to justify their actions right there in court. The judge immediately reprimanded them, telling them to respect the process. Their outburst only served to harm their credibility, and it felt validating to see the judge taking this seriously. Then came the twist I hadn't anticipated. A family friend who had been close to us for years stood up as a surprise witness. She explained that she'd been aware of how my parents had always prioritized my sister, even admitting that they'd borrowed from my college fund years ago to help with other family expenses. Her testimony brought everything into sharp focus, showing that this wasn't an isolated incident but a long-standing pattern of behavior. After a few days of deliberation, the judge reached a decision. The ruling came down in my favor. My parents were ordered not only to repay the stolen savings but also to compensate for the emotional distress this entire ordeal had caused. Relief washed over me, knowing that after all the back and forth, justice was finally served. But the outcome didn't bring any apologies. My parents looked devastated, but instead of admitting they'd done wrong, they blamed me for tearing the family apart. They were visibly angry, as if I'd betrayed them by standing up for myself. My sister sent me a final message after the verdict, a venomous rant declaring that I'd lost her as family forever. It was clear she wanted to hurt me, but at that point I knew I didn't need her approval or support. In therapy, I discussed the complex emotions that came with winning the case. It was a strange mix of relief and sadness. I hadn't just won a legal battle, I'd officially severed ties with my family. Processing that wasn't easy, but my therapist reminded me of how far I'd come, of the courage it had taken to stand my ground. A few weeks later, the payment came through. Seeing the funds back in my account was a moment of triumph. I finally had my savings back, the future I'd worked for was back in my control, and my goal of buying a home was alive again. My friends were thrilled for me. They threw a small celebration, acknowledging how hard I'd fought for my independence. It felt like a new beginning, a symbol of everything I'd endured and overcome. My parents tried one last time to reach out, sending a message through a mutual family member, claiming they wanted to mend fences. But I didn't respond. I knew that any reconciliation would likely lead to more pain, more guilt, and a repeat of the same old patterns. I wasn't going to reopen those wounds. I'd fought too hard to get here. With my finances back on track, I began looking at properties again. The home buying dream was more real than ever, and this time I'd be achieving it on my own terms, free from any family interference. I felt lighter, like I was stepping into a future where I was truly in charge. The toxic ties had been cut, and for the first time, I could focus on building a life that was entirely mine. This entire journey had been one of the hardest things I'd ever gone through. But as I moved forward, I realized that I'd gained so much more than I'd lost. I'd gained freedom, confidence, and the strength to stand up for myself, even when it meant standing alone. The chapter with my family was over, but a new one was just beginning.